So, thanks for the opportunity to speak here. It's a great privilege. My name is Christer Tryggestad. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey in Oslo. And
yes, I'm Ole Rolsa. I'm associate partner in our Amsterdam office, and well, I run our global energy perspective, which is basically the barrel counting that Rob indicated earlier, and I'm thinking into the future.
So, what we will talk about today is something we've named the global energy perspective in McKinsey. And the background for this is an observation that we and many others make, that the energy transition is happening and, if anything, is accelerating. Just some quotes there, both from the transport, from the power generation, and other sectors. What all this led us to was to say that this is actually very important for our clients to have a good understanding of the transition and what are the opportunities related to that transition. So we have spent the last 2 years developing a perspective on the demand development. What you can see on the left-hand side is our demand cube. We basically modeled energy demand across around 150 countries globally, across 20 demand sectors, so light vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, aviation, etc., and across around 50 fuel types, actually. So for each of these small boxes, we have a model modeling demand development in that specific segment and geography. And we do it from now until 2050. So what you may ask is, so why does McKinsey do this? I mean, we have lots of energy perspectives out there. Why do we need another one? And I think there are 3-4 reasons why we found that this is an important thing. One is we do this with a bigger or greater granularity than what we see others do. So I just talked about the number of cells. Secondly, we build on all the McKinsey knowledge globally to make sure that we get as good a prediction as possible. So when we want to understand energy demand for automotives in China and the transition towards electricity, we do that in cooperation with our people that serve automotive clients or governments in China to really get that understanding. The 2 last reasons are maybe the most important ones. We want to create a transparent and flexible perspective. With transparent, I mean that we want a perspective where it's possible to see what is actually driving the outcome. So if you were to make different assumptions, how would that influence the outcome? And the flexibility is that we want to allow our clients to do exactly that. So this model is now being put it's being a cloud-based model, so clients can actually go in and simulate themselves. So if they believe that solar cost is not going down as fast as we have in the reference case, what will then happen, for example? So those are the reasons why we developed this perspective. We currently have around 20 people working full-time on it. We will have 30 by the end of the year and probably a lot more in end of next year. So it's a pretty big effort for us. We will now go on to talk a bit about the findings, and we'll do it in four segments. So I'll first talk about overall energy demand and what we see happening there. We'll then talk a bit about the power side, an important segment. Ole will go on to talk about oil and discussion on peak oil that we've heard earlier today, and we'll give our perspective. And finally, we'll talk a bit about emissions and the resulting emissions from this perspective. But let me start with the overall demand. And I think the main message there is that we see a deceleration of energy demand globally, and that it is structural. So the deceleration is structural. Here you can see a set of different assumptions. And I think there's a couple of things to note there. One is that for all that have been updated between 2014 to 16, 15 to 17, it's been taken down. So the general sentiment is that companies, analysts believe that demand is going to be lower today than they did 2-3 years ago. Our prediction is what we call the reference case. It's lower than the others. So it's lower than other similar cases. So we believe in an even lower development of demand, 0.8% growth per year in energy demand. This is the perspective from November last year. we're releasing a new perspective on November this year, and it's going to be slightly lower than that again. Why do I say structural? The reason why we believe the demand deceleration is structural is threefold. One is that the GDP per capita is decelerating because we're getting older. So less and less people are actually working. That's the first one. Second is that economies are moving towards services, which is less energy intensive. And third is the drive for energy efficiency. So we believe that this is not a cycle, this is a structural deceleration. Still, and the good news for a Norwegian and for this group is that oil and gas is going to play a major role also in the future. So even when we look towards 2050, the majority of primary energy demand is going to be oil, gas, even though the growth is coming other places. So that's the first on energy demand in total. Let's look at power. Power is one segment that has been discussed a lot, and it's been discussed a lot because renewables is eating into what has traditionally been the space of coal and gas. First observation is that power demand is actually growing a lot faster than rest of energy demand. So while other energy demand is growing by 0.6% per year, power demand is growing 3 times as fast. That is, of course, driven by the electrification of several segments. It's driven by transport, as you can see, but as much by buildings and industry also electrifying. So there's a significant growth in power. On competitiveness, and this is something which has significantly changed over the last couple of years. If we go market by market, the cheapest form of new power generation capacity now is renewable generation. So this is not anymore a subsidy-driven growth. This is about the actual cost of renewable power generation. You may say, yes, that is all nice, but the cost of integrating renewable power into the system is also contributing. So even though the absolute cost of the power itself is lower, the integration cost may be higher. And that's true, but especially in markets with a lot of penetration. But for more and more markets, this is a cost-driven growth game. Secondly, if this is 2020, if you went to 2030, you would see that the cost of installing new renewable generation capacity is lower than using the existing conventional generation capacity. So the power market is actually transitioning relatively fast. The colors there are not really with me. Fantastic. Yes, thank you. So, what does this mean for the development? And we have 2 specific countries here. We've shown UK and Germany. Common for both from 2015 to 2040 is that renewables is growing. So solar and wind is growing in both markets. Where they differ is actually on the gas side. This is the gas side, where you can see that in UK, we see a significant decline in gas-fired power generation. In Germany, we see a continued growth in gas-fired power generation. A bit opposite to what we actually seen last years. The main reason is actually, and this is important for gas companies, the main reason is what is happening to nuclear. So what we see now is that the main determining factor in many markets for how much gas generation you will have is how much nuclear generation you will have. So in the UK, where you have the Hinkley Point, or at least still have the Hinkley Point coming on, even though it's now significantly more expensive than even offshore wind, as you saw in the latest bid, there was 57.5 pounds per megawatt hour with our friends in Dong Energy. That's significantly lower than the cost of the nuclear power plants being built. But still, if that is happening, that is going at the expense of natural gas. In Germany, where we see nuclear being phased out, there is a lot more room for natural gas. We've done the same in of course, other countries. You see the same, for example, in Spain, where you also have a phasing out of nuclear and a lot more gas being produced. So overall, just to summarize again, since this is oil and gas, what do we believe about gas-based generation? And the overall story is that this is still going to be significant, although less than today. So across a set of markets here, you can see that with Mexico, US greatly helped by very low gas prices. We actually see quite a lot of gas-based generation also for the 25-year horizon. Whereas in many other markets, it's actually going down quite a lot. With that, I'll leave it to Ole to talk a bit about oil demand.
Yes, thank you. So back to the question we had earlier with demand peaking, we also are being asked that question quite a bit by our clients. And as you can imagine, our clients are in all sectors, right? Obviously, oil and gas companies. I'm a gas guy. I have worked for 10 years just in gas, but also in renewables and in regulation. And ultimately, the key deciding points will be chemicals and transport from our view. Complex chart. Let's spend some time on this chart, though. I think I would start on the bottom right of this chart, and that's a number or two numbers that probably are interesting for you. It's the growth in barrels from basically 96 million to 108 from now over the next 20 years until 2035, right? So the simple picture is there's a lot of more demand coming. What we've then tried to dissect in columns and in rows in this chart is a little bit where do we see which development. And if we focus on the rows first, I think the highlighted blue ones, chemicals and aviation, are ultimately the most interesting and the most positive, right? Obviously, and with all of the economic growth in a lot of the world regions, we have a significant amount of growth still in chemicals, right? The 6.7 obviously is more than half of the total growth that we see across all regions and segments. The other big growth sector remains aviation, right? Similar story. We do see aviation passengers still increase for the foreseeable future. Right? We think until 2050, that's a constantly growing number. And obviously, there are efficiency developments, but we don't see those offsetting that growth. The slightly less fortunate picture from an oil and gas perspective is then maybe the two rows above that and the residential and commercial bucket. Let me just shine a quick light on that. Right, light vehicles and heavy vehicles, obviously trucks and passenger cars. Many people follow the news around Tesla and now all sorts of other traditional car makers moving to electric. That's not really making a massive difference here, as you see, in terms of overall liquids demand in our reference case. Right? So obviously there's a huge amount of growth in terms of number of cars worldwide for the foreseeable future. Therefore, despite electric cars and despite efficiency increases, we do still, until 2035, see a growth of that demand. It's slightly less positive on the heavy vehicle side. And maybe one other aspect to just double-click on in the second to last row, residential and commercial, and Europe, that's to a large extent oil losing against gas and heat pumps in heating. If we translate that into a longer-term perspective just by segment, right? This is now worldwide and in colors by segment, and until 2050, that growth is still inclusive of a peak, right? So we've just seen the increase until 2035. However, with a decline in orange in road transport over the next 35 years, we do see overall oil demand peaking. However, back to Rob's presentation earlier,
This is very far away from something in the next 5 years. This is obviously much longer term. And again, please mind between 2016 and 2015, the absolute number. Right? We're talking 97 to 105. Obviously, that's an additional 8 million barrels per day. We've then tried to look at sensitivities, right? And please look at the left-hand side of this chart first. We've tried to condense the chart that we've just seen, right, up to 2037. That's our reference case, the peak there, significant growth until then. And then we've tried to look at a couple of sensitivities, right? Typically, clients ask us, so what happens if? And then we looked into a number of things, right? The first thing was increased recycling. In our base case, this is global rates, right? We have 7%, that's, in our reference case, and in the 2035 scenario, we've assumed 9%. There is a world in which you could believe that you go up to 25%, right? Just for reference, in countries like Germany or UK, you are at the moment at rates around that point. To achieve that on a global level in China, India, Brazil, etc., obviously is quite a way to go. Similarly, packaging efficiency, right? This is going to be another driver. How much plastic do you actually need, impacting overall oil demand? And then it's 2 buckets on electrification, right? It's back to what I just said. Passenger cars, we assume at the moment that by 2035, so in 18 years, we have globally 35% of new car sales electric. If we are slightly more progressive, that could be higher, right? It could be the 66%. Again, a reminder, Europe isn't a template of the world, right? In India, imagining the charging infrastructure to be fully electric obviously takes a bit longer than it may do in our European countries. And similarly, for trucks, we've also assumed a more aggressive case of 49% of worldwide new truck sales. In that scenario, you get, on the left-hand side, to this other peak, right? Peak in 2027. Obviously, that's much, much closer, 10 years, but compared to the extreme estimates that you hear every once in a while, even this slightly more progressive scenario has a peak only in 10 years' time. And a peak that, let me remind you, is still higher than current consumption. Very quickly on the gas side, given that I have a gas background, the picture is a lot more positive even. Let's look at the first half of the chart on the left, right? And this is all in BCM and the current demand worldwide. The main growth is, little surprisingly, still in power, right? So while Krista has just shown us that obviously there's a lot of renewables being built, there's also a lot of gas power plants being built and being switched back on. Ultimately, that's a big driver of the growth. Then industrialization in non-OECD countries and the heat processes there, and then a little bit buildings. So we do see a significant 21% increase over the next 15 or 14 years. If we think extreme and think higher penetration of renewables, which is going to be quite tough, right? Integrating those efficiently into the system. If we think heat process replacement in industry, which again is quite tough because the high heat processes being replaced by electricity at the moment aren't commercial. And if we assume faster penetration of heat pumps, yes, we could go to a lower demand scenario, but still it will be a higher demand than we have at the moment. Interestingly enough, and having seen the numbers Krista showed and quite some change, one thing doesn't really change. We are also being asked a lot by our clients, so how does that relate to a 2-degree scenario? And I can't judge a 2-degree scenario. What we've just tried to compare our scenario to is an emissions scenario. Right, so let's not talk about degrees, let's talk about emissions. And we have just, for comparison, here in red, included the IEA 450 scenario, which is assuming the estimated amount of emissions you would require to keep the global warming to 2 degrees. If we compare that with our, from my view, already somewhat green scenario, we are still significantly off. So to summarize, the deceleration of energy demand growth is structural, but fossil keeps a significant share. Renewables do outcompete, but again, gas maintains a share, and this is super country specific. Differences are very large. Potential peak oil is quite a bit out, 10 to 20 years at least, and mostly driven by chemicals and transport. The emissions targets are still very difficult to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you have any questions for the gentleman, please let me know. Just raise your hand. Otherwise, I have a few.
Yes.
Well, Ole, you mentioned just as one of the last things, those forecasts, we have to keep an eye on chemicals, aviation, vehicles. But what can significantly change those estimates? Would that be technological development, the political will, or how do you see it?
Well, it's a bit of both, right? And sometimes it's even just behaviors, so just human behaviors, right? How many people buy tablets? The question today is how many people will actually want the slightly changed behavior from using electric cars. That's clearly one driver. Rob was giving the example of consumers in the US liking the idea of bigger cars, right? To what extent is that changing? And then, yes, what you just said, technological advancement is going to just change the relative cost of technologies, right? And obviously, we've now assumed certain learning rates and therefore prices, competitive prices in the future, but that's the other aspect, and then regulation will have to do something to make those changes happen.
And I guess when it comes to technology, just the last few years shown us that it's just really, really difficult to forecast how the technological development will be. We have this very, very strong computer power developing, and so it can take us anywhere. Basically, it must be very difficult to make those forecasts.
It is. But I think if there's anything we learned from watching some of these technologies is that it tends to go faster, at least in the medium to long term, than expected. And I think especially for electricity and transport, battery is important. Scale is important. I mean, you know, start seeing this is moving from being a niche type of activity in some few companies to the big car manufacturing factories doing this seriously. I think that will drive penetration a lot. And then regulation. You saw some of the quotes, as you mentioned as well, with China recently, but also many other European countries starting to talk about banning diesel. Of course, that will have a big impact.
Mm-hmm. In a minute, I'll have a discussion with one of the operators. What do you think they should watch for, the sector itself? What's really sensitive at the moment?
Oil and gas operators. Mm-hmm. First, I would be a bit comforted by the fact that there is a lot of oil and gas to be consumed in the future. We talk a lot about peak oil, but peak oil is in reality a relatively insignificant happening, right? Because of the depletion of 4-5% a year. What would be significant is if oil started declining by 4-5% a year, because then you have enough capacity. But that is, so oil is very different from aluminum or other industries in that sense. Mm-hmm. But I think there are two areas that I would look upon as exciting growth opportunities. And one is hydrogen. I know hydrogen has been a difficult story. I don't believe personally in hydrogen for cars. I think that their electricity is beating it by a good margin, and it's going much faster. But in many other applications where you can decarbonize the natural gas at platform or at big locations and then use the hydrogen instead to get emission-free energy, that is one area which I think has a lot of potential to decarbonize the part that is very hard to decarbonize otherwise. And then it is CCS. Again, a very difficult technology, I know. And again, I do not at all believe in CCS for power generation. Renewables is way past that point. But I do believe in CCS for other emission sources where there is no competition, cement, other industries.
Let's have a quick question from the floor.
First of all, thank you very much for sharing this with us. We had a meeting yesterday afternoon in the board of Oil Gas Denmark, and we were exactly talking about this. And I think one of the challenges we're going to have as an industry is actually conveying some of these messages. And I don't believe what you just talked about mirrors very well the public opinion. With that, I mean, when you listen to politicians, civil servants even, journalists. So I was just curious, when you travel around and share this, what are the reactions from people, so to speak, outside the industry when they hear this?
No, it's an interesting question because we've been traveling around presenting this most places in the world and to very different industry associations. So I think a couple of like generic observations. First is in general, when we talk to oil and gas assemblies like this, we're seen as being too progressive. I mean, we've been a little bit conservative today. If you ask me for my personal belief, where do I think the transition is going, it's not a reference case we presented today. It's more like the energy transition scenario. But still, so we're seen as a little bit too progressive. We're also seen as a bit too progressive when we're in Asia and in the US, parts of the US. We're seen as far as conservative, even with the progressive scenario here, when we talk to many renewables companies, new technology companies, anywhere, Western US, Europe. In general, I think if you talk to people that are in a way agnostic, then they tend to be more attached to the flashy messages about renewables, non-subsidy-free renewables, etc. Of course, so that's where they would land. But there's a big difference in perception depending on who you talk to. So you know pretty well what the questions is going to be when you go into a setting like this.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your views.
Thank you.